When I first visited Seattle in the summer of 1997, one of my wife's friends was taking care of Jean Jungaward, who had had a long career as a well-known interior designer. She lived on Queen Anne Hill, and her home was like a museum. She had collected things from all over the world and juxtaposed it in her own environment: Buddhist and Aztec, art and literature, the sacred and the profane. For example, she used a communion cabinet in her kitchen. In traditional cultures, there is no division between art and craft. Novelty or uniqueness is not as important as mastery. In modern culture, especially consumer culture, which aspires towards connoisseurship, it all becomes grist for the mill. The ethnic artifacts are all mixed together like ingredients in a big gumbo, which we call the melting pot. American art is first and foremost a mixture. Even if you're a purist, you're just part of the mix. East and West, near and far is a pretty accurate description of our geographical and psychological condition when we began this series of paintings. In 1997, I had not set foot in the United States for 9 years, and my wife Yona, with whom I collaborate, had been living in Israel for 16 years. We began at that time traveling back and forth between our home in Israel and New York, where my family is, and also Seattle, where Yona is from. So it was East, West, and Middle East. Our patio in Israel. The chair belonged to Yona's mother, who died when Yona was 9 months old. And this was the pottery studio on our patio before we moved back to the United States. These are the only two from our own home, and like many of these, it's a home that no longer exists. This is a collection of Russian nesting dolls at the home of our friend Toby Schuster in Jerusalem. Toby's break front. There are a lot of dolls and puppets in people's houses. Here's one from my mother's apartment on East 79th Street in New York City, along with an Acoma Pueblo pot, which she's since given to me. For a good year, the Pacific Northwest was just too majestic for me, too snow-capped, so I just photographed interiors. This is from a cabin on John's Island in the Puget Sound, a small island with no electricity. Those are whale vertebrae on the mantle. More found objects, an outdoor shadow box on John's Island. Which brings us to the subject of bones. Still life with skulls was a very popular theme in the Dutch Reformation, a moralistic lesson on the brevity of life. We were invited to a party at the Thomas home in Woodinville, Washington, one of the oldest log homes in the area. Pillow dolls. These are all from that party in Woodinville. And in the closet, some bad clown art. So this is good clown art about bad clown art. Yona and I combine her painting with my photography. This series is oil pastels over black and white photography on cotton rag paper. We found this marionette in the town of Cairo, New York. Everyone is a collector. Everyone collects something: art, cookie jars, baseball cards. But the older they are, the more interesting their collections, both the things themselves and their arrangement. First of all, people usually don't inherit things until they themselves reach a certain age. This is what's called provenance, or the history of ownership of a thing. Second of all, when a house has been occupied for a long time by the same people, things seem to settle into their places and start to relate to their environment. People's mementos are like icons. These last few were from the home of Pat Ballard, Yona's adoptive mother, whom I fortunately got to know quite well before she died. We visited the home of Barbara and Jack Thomas in Seattle. He has published a book about growing up in Walla Walla in eastern Washington in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, he did a lot of hunting and fishing. He sold one or two of his decoys to buy this painting from us. His wife Barbara was an interior designer, and there's a story how she once traded a truck full of beer for a painting. Nutcrackers from the home of Pat and Steve Anderson. He's a plastic surgeon and she's a stockbroker, and they were high school friends of Yona's. I would say this represents the uttermost west. Eskimo mask from the Dupenthaler residence in Seattle. He used to own a gallery on Pioneer Square. Ruth Kelsey was about 90 when we visited her at her home in Bellingham, Washington. This is her night table. The photograph shows her at age 5. She had retired many years ago as professor of art at Western Washington University, and she told us many stories that day. She had been selected by one of her professors in the 1930s to make paintings of the chiefs of local tribes, and she showed us those paintings which she was donating to a museum. She was a very close friend of Yona's grandparents and had made a trip to Mexico with her grandmother. While we were visiting, she excused herself and took a 5-minute nap, waking herself with a timer. Quite a character. She's no longer with us. Most of our work has something to do with the theme of East meeting West, and also maybe because of the documentary aspect of the underlying photography, we are interested in preservation, in this case of people's interiors, how their homes reflect who they are or were.